I don't know at what time of day you're listening to this reflection, but whatever time of day it is, you're very welcome. And I'd just like to spend a couple of moments reflecting. And in order to do that, I'd like you to watch and to listen.
The King of love, my shepherd is, whose goodness faileth never. I nothing lack if I am his, and he is mine forever. And he is mine forever. Where streams of living water flow, my ransom soul he leadeth, and where the verdant pastures grow, with food celestial feedeth, with food celestial feedeth. Perverse and foolish oft I stray, but yet in love he sought me, and on his shoulder gently lay, and home rejoicing brought me, and home rejoicing brought me. In death's dark veil I fear no ill, with thee, dear Lord, beside. Thy rod and staff my comfort still. Thy cross before to guide me, thy cross before to guide me. And so through all the length of days, thy goodness faileth never. Good Shepherd, may I sing thy praise, within thy house forever. Within thy house forever.
When I last recorded a reflection in this series of 3 called What Sort of Church Do You Want?, I spoke of a welcoming, open church, and posed some questions that might need to be held in our hearts and minds as a result of COVID-19. I'd like to further that reflection. If we are to be a church of welcome, then it stands to reason that we have to become more fully a church of compassion. Only Nuam writes, compassion means to suffer with, to live with those who suffer. When Jesus saw the woman of Nain, he realized this is a widow who has lost her only son, and he was moved by compassion. He felt the pain of the woman in his guts. He felt the pain of that woman so deeply in his spirit that out of compassion, he could give that son back to his mother. One of the most compassionate people I've ever met is a priest called Richard Mackay. I've marveled at his capacity to walk alongside refugees and displaced people as I've got to know him a little over the years. In 1978, Richard moved from working in Taunton in Somerset to Knowle West in Bristol, which is a very run-down area, high intergenerational unemployment and overcrowded housing. It seemed as though to Richard it was a broken community that had little hope. And he admits that he struggled to adapt to this completely different community than the one he'd worked in before. It was around about that time that he heard about Oscar Romero living and working in El Salvador in Central America. Richard was captivated by Romero and his struggle. And he described how on the morning of Romero's assassination, he was in his kitchen having breakfast when he heard the news. And at that moment, he says, he knew that God had placed a call on his life. He was to spend his life sharing with and living for the poor, a life of compassion. This is what Richard says. As a priest, a shepherd of God's people, Oscar Romero has inspired me and changed the course of my life and my understanding of the message of Jesus. I see in him this shepherd of the poor and prophet of justice, this voice of the voiceless, the person of Jesus, risen and alive today. So since then, Richard has lived his life trying to show that face of compassion for the world. His parish in Bristol is a haven of welcome for people of all sorts of persuasions. And the community walk alongside so-called failed asylum seekers and those seeking asylum, refugees, sex workers, and ex-prisoners, to name just a few groups. You know, right at the center of our Christian faith is the cross. And the cross, I think, always holds an invitation to enter compassionately into the pain of the world. It's a reminder to us that following the gospel way will invariably involve suffering. We can't avoid it if we are to be compassion for the world. The question for me is whether or not we want to be a church of compassion or a church that is removed from the lives of people. Mark, in his gospel, has Jesus reflect on what it means to be a disciple after Peter's declaration of faith. And it's a very hard message to take. To follow Jesus is to take on the pain of others and somehow in the doing of that, transform that pain into life. This is a real challenge, not to run away from the pain of the world, but to enter into it. The only way, Mark tells us, to enter into life is through death. We have to let ourselves be vulnerable. We have to allow ourselves to be weak. We have to encounter life and be touched and broken by it. If we don't, then Christianity remains beautiful poetry, deep philosophy, or empty ritual. The example of Jesus to his followers is to find life through death. It costs Jesus to heal the sick, emotionally and physically. It cost Jesus not to give in to his own needs and desires. It cost him to face his own pain and hurt. It cost him to trust God when he hung on the cross. But he did all of that so that we would know the truth, that from each death, life can spring. When we take up the cross, we become witnesses to the Jesus way, the way that is all about love and compassion. You know, at the core of the gospel, it is a God who has compassion on the world. The depth of God's love means that God suffers with those who are broken and in pain. God is moved in the depths of God's being, so much so that God chooses to live in the midst of this messy world. So this compassionate, merciful God became flesh in Jesus, so that we would see in a human person the face of God and have an encounter with that compassion that is in the heart of God. It's that same compassion that can fill our hearts by the gift of the Holy Spirit. To walk the Jesus way is to allow that compassion to flow through us into the world. It's a challenging question to ask ourselves just how compassionate we might be. You know, to walk the Jesus way means to see every individual as a unique creation of God, whoever they may be, regardless of what differential we care to put on people. To walk the Jesus way is to have our hearts torn apart because of the pain of the world. To walk the Jesus way is to stand on the side of those most rejected, the asylum seeker, the refugee, the outcast, the AIDS sufferer, those who live on the edges of society for whatever reason. This will always lead to clashes and disagreements, because to be on the side of the little one is to press the buttons of those who are controlled by their ego and live terrified of losing what little power they think they have. That conflict and the suffering and rejection that can come from it is the cross. I love this quotation that I came across recently from Tullian Tigavadian, who is an American clergyman. He wrote this: "The gospel alone liberates you to live a life of scandalous generosity, unrestrained sacrifice, uncommon valor, and unbounded courage." Wow. The gospel alone liberates you to live a life of scandalous generosity. Is your generosity a scandal? Is your sacrifice unrestrained? And what of your courage and valor. Uncommon, unbounded. When we carry the cross of the pain and tragedy of the world, we are to be as generous and sacrificial and strong as we can be. I think that's particularly important and true when we begin to recognize how important the values of simplicity and just living are. The questioning of the economic systems that control society and allow some to starve while others live on the backs of the poor will inevitably become part of life. To be church is to enter into the pain of the world, to feel the pain of those struggling for justice and experiencing persecution, and to do what we can to alleviate those realities. To be church is to feel the pain of those whose dignity is eroded by unjust government policies. It's to try and walk with those who have to resort to food banks and who live on the brink of homelessness. To be church is to stand alongside those who suffer from discrimination of any form, entering into the needs of others, helping others find life in the death that they experience. And it is to experience suffering and rejection because of our willingness to stand for gospel truth and to absorb those things and return them in love and compassion. The scorn of and the dismissal of others for the sake of the gospel is the cross. If all that I believe is true, then it causes me immense sadness to see my own Catholic tradition, which I love, besmirched with sexual scandal and a neoconservatism among some younger people that isn't life-giving. I see huge amounts of energy wasted on ritual and getting ritual right. There is a need for many to be doctrinally pure and correct, and orthodoxy is of immense importance to a huge part of the church. But while I respect those things as being important to many, compassion is more important. Ronald Rolheiser, the great spiritual writer, wrote when reflecting on all of this, the German poet Goethe once wrote, "The dangers of life are many, and safety is one of those dangers. This is true in our personal lives, and it's true in Christian orthodoxy. There is danger in bad dogma, but there is equal danger in not radiating with sufficient compassion and understanding God's universal will for the salvation of all peoples." We have to ask ourselves the question whether or not compassion matters more than being right. Mark's Jesus doesn't offer us an easy life when he invites us to take up the cross and become, like him, the suffering servant. It demands metanoia within us, that transformation that the gospel invites us to every time it uses that little word repent. You know, everything we're told by the media that is necessary for a happy and fulfilled life, material wealth, sexual prowess, a strong egocentric push for life, fades into insignificance in the shadow of the call to be compassionate. In fact, the opposite becomes true as we discover that human fulfillment doesn't lie in possessions or power or prestige, but in the laying down of those things. I think, you know, we are living in the West in a culture where people are desperate for others to walk with them in their needs. And yet as church, all we often seem to be worried about is not losing my Mass. How can that be the gospel of Jesus? This Jesus who says, take up your cross and follow me. And so to the challenge. Are we prepared to go the extra mile for those who have no one to be there for them, who at times need a listening ear? Are we known for the level of compassion in our parish communities? Are our parish communities places of healing love for those who are at the end of their tether? And what about those who exhibit unreasonable behavior, those who live on the edges? How do we respond? It's not easy to walk alongside others. In fact, it's very costly. We have to take the risk to let go of ingrained attitudes and prejudices and take up the call to be compassionate. It's a long, hard slog to take the risk to be with the poor and the needy, who because of their pain can often be ungrateful. Sometimes we will be challenged to let go of the neat little religious package that we've created for ourselves, to listen to the promptings of the Spirit and let compassion flow like a river. I guess, to take up the cross demands that we call on the power of God to fill us and empower us. And God will always answer that prayer. So to be church is to be welcoming. To be church is to be compassionate. To be church is to be open to otherness, and at times to be willing to lay down what we hold dear for the sake of compassion. So as I draw this reflection to a conclusion, I'd invite you again to watch and to listen. Thank you.
Open my eyes, Lord. Help me to see your face. Open my eyes, Lord. Help me to see. Open my ears, Lord. Help me to hear your voice. Open my ears, Lord. Help me to hear. Open my heart, Lord. Help me to love like you. Open my heart, Lord. Help me to love.
Loving God, open our hearts so that we may feel the breath and play of your Spirit. Open our lips that we may drink in the delight and wonder of life. Open our ears to hear your voice in the cries of all humanity. Open our eyes so that we may see Christ in friend and stranger.
Open my heart, Lord. Help me to love like you. Open my heart, Lord. Help me to Help me